Welcome to When We Die Talks. I'm your host, Zach Ansell. In this podcast, we explore different beliefs about what happens when we die and how those ideas shape the way we live. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by The Dead Book. Okay, let's get real for a second. How prepared are your parents, your siblings, your partner, or even you for the future? We're not talking about the fun stuff, but the hard stuff, end-of-life planning. It's a tough conversation, but that's why The Dead Book exists. The Dead Book makes it easy to plan ahead, even if you think you don't have the time, money, or assets. It's affordable, straightforward, and designed to give you and your loved ones peace of mind. They've made it their mission to help others avoid the chaos and stress that comes with being unprepared. Visit thedeadbook.co and get started today. And just for listening, use the code WWDT at checkout for 15% off. Today's episode features my longtime friend, Annah Yevelenko. We've known each other for over a decade, originally connecting through the photography industry. When I launched the voicemail project last year, Annah was one of the first to reach out about it, and we began to have deeper conversations about life and death. This episode was recorded at the beginning of summer, and I'm excited to finally share it with the world. Annah has been one of the biggest supporters of this project and is part of a small group of people who helped push me get this podcast created. Her perspective on death is shaped by her experiences and her certification as a death doula, which gives her a unique understanding of the topic. Our conversation touches on how we can better approach death and how it has shaped both of our lives. I think you'll find her insights incredibly valuable. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So you and I go
way back.
Yeah, a decent ways back. We've worked in the photography industry together, probably known each other for 15-ish years.
It's been an interesting journey to where we started off with as colleagues in completely different industry than this and learning about each other as we go along. And then I think like during COVID, we I feel like so many people got closer together and then some people just didn't think about anything else in life. But it was interesting to one day just open up my Instagram and see that you were doing this incredible project and being like, excuse me, I love this so much. How can I be part of it?
Thank you. Yeah, you've definitely been probably the biggest supporter of the project. And I can't thank you enough for that. Every time I post, you're commenting, you're sharing, getting people to do voicemails.
Handing out cards and bars.
Handing out cards and bars. So yeah, I appreciate you being so forthcoming and supportive of the project. But yeah, it's definitely been interesting to go from like the photography industry to then like, I think we did a random job where we were both like driving down to Eugene and like talking about how much we love food. But yeah, and then when I started this project, you were like right on top of it. And we started having conversations around death. And it was so nice to have like almost an immediate outlet. Like I put this thing out into the world and it's kind of scary. You put something out into the void and you hope that people resonate or it resonates with other people as much as it does you. And like immediately you're on it. So we started meeting up, having like coffee, actually tea. We did tea. And, I had time scheduled of like, oh yeah, we'll probably meet up for like an hour and a half. And I tell my wife like, oh yeah, I'll be back in, like 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then I look at my watch and be like, oh, we've been talking for 4 hours. And that's happened on multiple occasions. Yeah. So it's been really nice to have a person just excited to talk about this topic. And so it should not be a surprise that you're one of the first people on the podcast. So yeah, thank you.
My absolute pleasure. And I think the timing was just absolutely perfect that you did start it when you did. We both kind of agreed that we have spent a lot of time in this industry, in the photography industry, and that we were looking for something more. And again, I think the timing was perfect because I had just gotten my death doula certification. So I'm also kind of floating in this abyss of I don't know anybody else in this industry. And I want to share and I want to talk about it all the time. And so to see this like completely random, I think it just literally popped up on my screen and I was like, wait, what? Wait, you're doing what? That's so fucking cool. Like I think it's a brilliant idea. And that's why when we met, I was like, this has to be a podcast act. Like this is like, you have to keep going. You have to do this. Like fuck everything else. You got to do this. This is so, I mean, it's so important. I think this is so, so important for people to connect with and to break down stigmas and to have conversations. This doesn't have to be a scary thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like a perfect segue, like mentioning like death doula. What is your relationship with death? And I think, part of that is, death doula, which it might be helpful for people to know more about what that means to you. I'm sure there's some other things that what's your relationship with death?
So my relationship with death is multifaceted. I feel like I've been fascinated with death, I think, ever since I was a child. I was an only child. I had a lot of time on my hands to be alone and think about things. And I remember realizing that there was some shock value with it and that I can utilize it as a protective measure against bullies or anybody in school, because I was a weird art kid, and that was not really very accepted growing up. And so I was like, you know what? If they want to talk about something, then they can talk about it. So I remember carrying the Necronomicon around in high school and like painting live backwards on my forehead, or like just playing with makeup too, but having that happen. And I remember I got into psychology in high school, and going to the library, there was, in the psychology kind of area, there were books about the occult. And the books in the occult at the time had to do with like Satanism, the satanic panic and all of that stuff. So that was, and that talked a lot about death, which was very fascinating. Then I moved to San Francisco, and I remember the founder of the Satanic Bible's house was like down the street from where I was living. So I had to go visit that. So it's just been it's almost been like kitsch in a sense, and it makes a lot of sense also because I was a child. And when you're a child, you're invincible. You don't have much opportunity to experience death. Most people don't.
Yeah.
And my first full experience with death was watching my grandmother just kind of, it took her a very long time to leave, but it was a process, and I was there almost every step of the way. And when it happened, the actual process of her dying happened fairly quickly. And I remember I had a conversation with her when she was non-responsive, but I remember having a conversation with her and saying, I don't think you need to stick around anymore. Like, you're good. I don't want you to be in pain anymore. I love you. And I kissed her face, and like, that was that. And it was so peaceful. Like, she looked so peaceful. And I remember the day she died, I was not with her, but everybody else was. And that was kind of a bummer for me. But somebody said that when I came back to work, they said that there was a light kind of hitting my back at that specific time. And there was a little bit of smoke swirling inside around it. So that was really cool. I felt like I saw signs or something of her after she died. And I've just never given up on being fascinated with death. And as I got older, you come to terms with your mortality more and more, and having friends die, having family members die, life kind of comes to the forefront more so than death, but we forget that death is always there.
Yeah.
And I think with the death doula, I think I heard something on it, like on NPR, and was like, what is this thing they're talking about? And then looking more and more into it, I'm like, I want to be certified. And as there are doulas for pregnant women and for the beginning of life, it only makes sense that we have that for the end of our physical life's journey. And having not known anything about it, now I definitely have more of an understanding, not as much practice as I want, but more of an understanding. And I got my doula certification the same time I got my trauma-informed coaching certification, which was interesting because then doing the doula right kind of in tandem, it says a doula is actually a life coach until the very end. So the two of them go hand in hand, which is really cool to me. And what I've learned through the process is there are so many things you can do as a death doula, which is a non-medical and a non-legal profession. So everything like your will is separate, and any sort of medical care that you might need is very separate. This is more of, I am here to advocate for your needs and help you create the best possible death for whatever that looks like for you. And I realized through the process, for me, I would like to concentrate on the life aspect of death. And I want to facilitate stuff like life, like living funerals. I want to facilitate legacy projects. I want to facilitate anything and everything that celebrates your life until the very, very end, so that when you go, you have more of you're calm and you are filled with emotions of your life being full versus our society kind of pumping that death is scary and sad.
I think we're moving more towards that being something that more and more people are doing. It's not just waiting until we're on our deathbed, that it's like, okay, and I think that's a healthy thing to do, right? It's, the more you dive into death, I think the more you live.
100%.
The more, each day that I, worked on this project, read about death, whatever, it's making me appreciate now more. So I think you have people that are moving towards like, hey, if I'm going to die, I'm going to live it well. And that also involves, like I love the idea of having like a living funeral.
Yeah. I don't know why this is not like practice. Like, who gives a shit when you're just meat in the ground or ground up or whatever, however you want, your body to be disposed of. But like, why wouldn't you want to hear the beautiful things people have to say around you, about you? Why wouldn't you want those people in your life while it is here? And then when you die, sure, you can still have a burial or a ceremony of some sort. And that's absolutely within everything that you are allowed to do. But I feel like we should be engaging in conversations about this way more to give people the option. I mean, I was just driving to Seattle with my mom, and she was like, oh, guess what? Like, I paid for my cremation, and, there's money left over if you want to do flowers. And I was like, but what do you want? Like, this is not my party. And then we got to talking, and I explained to her about a living funeral. And she's like, wow, I've never even heard about something like that. And a lot of people haven't. And I think another reason why this project is so important is to spread that information, because there are, there's death cafes happening. Most people don't know what the fuck that is.
Yeah.
People don't, again, our society, we're so programmed for death to be this ominous, terrible, horrible, sad, tragic thing. Just like when I tell people I'm a certified death doula, they're like, oh my God, that must be so hard for you.
Must be so depressing.
So depressing. And I'm like, well, if you think about it, it's actually the opposite, because it makes you value your moments so much more, knowing and being faced with this thing that is inevitable for everybody. And when you don't know when it's going to come. So why not plan for, if you have the opportunity to have a good death?
Yeah. I think I fall into like this because of my dad. I think he has a very interesting approach on things, because I think he kind of a little bit different than what you're saying is he doesn't care what a funeral looks like. He's like, that's not for me. Mm-hmm. That's for everybody else. Mm-hmm. That's for those who are left behind. He's such an introvert and such a hermit that I don't think you'd ever do something like a living funeral. But I love the idea of like, hey, I'm going to do a living funeral, and then you guys decide what you want to do in some capacity. If I died before my wife, it's like, what's going to make you happy? What's going to make the grief easier?
Well, and that's where the death doula comes in a lot of the times, because we have the questions to ask.
Yeah.
We have the prompts in order to see where you kind of lie in this. So that's, if your dad is not into living funerals because he's an introvert, does he want to leave something for you? Does he want to leave anything for the people he loves in his life? So that's where a legacy project would come in. And it can be anything from putting together a scrapbook to recipes to going through pictures together and putting together like a little collage or something that's very personal that the dying person is leaving behind for the people they love. And it is like, it's very tangible, which is a lot of times what, another topic, obviously, but like the topic of spirituality and people holding on and saying, like a soul is not leaving this plane because they're holding on to someone. So this is another one of those things, whether you believe it or not, even logically, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, totally. He basically just says we can put him in a coffee can.
Perfect. And that's all, that's also fair. I'm like, right. Throw me in the ground and make me worm food. Like that's where I am.
Yeah, that's me too. I want to be a tree, or I want to be something like that. Like I think it's called a sky burial. And it's like, if you've lived off the earth your entire life, like why should the earth why should you not return to the earth the same way? Why? I think it's a thing, and I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but I think it's like Tibetan, and it's just kind of like vultures and like animals consume your body,
Yeah.
which is not something that you can really do here.
Right.
But I like the idea of like, hey, I'm of this earth and I'm going to go back to it.
Well, I mean, this is the same. I mean, there are different things. Like there are state parks within this country too, right now, that are offering these green burials under trees. And to me, while, don't get me wrong, I love cemeteries. I have been like, that is, I mean,
you and my sister.
The Crow is one of my favorite movies. Okay. No, but I love cemetery. And right now, even my 7-year-old child loves going for strolls in the cemetery with me because it's peaceful.
Yeah.
It is those are really, really peaceful, beautiful, usually very well kept places.
Yeah.
While I have an affinity for those, I want nothing to do with them. And I don't want like, my grandparents are buried in a cemetery. And like, my mom's like, oh, like, we on their birthday, we're going to go visit grandma. And I'm like, she's not fucking there, dude.
Yeah.
So to me, the idea of being buried under a tree or in a park or something that has to do with being outdoors in an environment where you can walk around and like actually appreciate what's around you and having to, to say like, oh, you can sit under my shade. You know what I mean? Like something, but while you're also contributing back to the earth in some way. Because I'm like, why am I mean, that's, again, everybody has their right and everybody gets to decide what that looks like for them. And I respect absolutely everybody's opinion. My opinion is that I don't want to pay for a box.
Yeah.
I don't need to pay for embalming, which is actually quite gnarly for the planet as it goes. And also if you think about it.
That might be a nice way of putting it.
I mean, but if you think about it too, the cemetery only holds bodies for a certain amount of time before they get discarded. So why not just be discarded, not having to be chopped up into firewood later?
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name, but there's one in Southern Oregon that looks super cool that I'm like, I think my wife would have maybe some issues, but when our 17-year-old dog passes, I'm like, they have a little pet cemetery. Yeah. I'm like, I would love to like take him down there. Yeah. And I just don't know. Like,
but have you asked him what he wants?
No. I should probably work on that. So yeah, we're kind of getting into like spirituality. Mm-hmm. What, I think the big question is, what do you think happens when we die?
It's interesting, this question, because first of all, I watched this movie called Powder in the late 90s, I think, early 2000s. And there was a quote that somebody said. It was like, Einstein said that if we used 100% of our brain, we would no longer need bodies because we would be pure energy. And I'm of the understanding that our body is a vessel, and this thing called a soul that some people say is actually the energy. It's electricity that runs through our bodies that makes us move and groove. And when the body is no longer functioning, where does that energy go? And so my belief is that that energy has to go out into the universe, and it's kind of where, your memory is alive through other people, which is kind of like keeping your soul alive. And the soul is a very interesting kind of entity for me because I'm not a religious person in any way. So for me, a soul, when I do say something like soul, it actually means the energy that is constantly being cycled and recycled inside of you, and it always goes somewhere. And so to me, we leave that energy while we are still alive with people. And those could be interpreted as memories, or it could be that feeling that you get when you think about another person. And so their energy is almost like we exchange these energies constantly. So it's almost like we're living inside of other people, and other people are living with us. So when the body is no longer functioning and breathing, then that energy just moves about. That being said, I've been having these kind of conversations with my husband, who is like a staunch atheist / we consider ourselves atheists / apathetic agnostics. And so he's very much a man of science. And he's like, no, you just fucking die, which is depressing to me. But at the same time, does definitely like spark that zest for life inside of me even more.
Yeah.
And that being said, we have these debates. So I'm like, okay, well, how do you explain, when a person is dying, there are so many cases of people saying, oh yeah, I saw a white light. I saw my family members, or being able to say, oh, I saw my grandma wearing this dress. And that person had no idea what that grandma was buried in. And it turns out that grandma was buried in that same dress. They're seeing her. So like, that's where the apathetic agnostic in me shows up, where I'm like, well, maybe, but then my husband's like, well, your brain releases this chemical when you die. It's the same chemical as when you're sleeping, right? And why wouldn't it be just how our brains are kind of processing the body shutting down? And it's our memories, it's our brain. So there's, I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated, and that's another reason why I very much welcome death when it comes, and I want to see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's basically how I started the project. Was I'm a photographer, right? Or that's something I do. And so I have that creative brain, but I definitely view myself more as like an analytical mind. And so looking at science and all that stuff, I definitely am like, all right, you fade to black, game over, and it's done. But I think there is an element on like the creative side and exploring, well, wait, what happens if that's not true? My dad always says never say never, and 0 is a very small number. So I hesitate to say never, but we will never know, at least here on this plane. And so I think I want to explore the idea of like, what else is out there? We have almost 8 billion people. There's generally a lot of overlap with religion and different thought processes and whatnot, but there's a lot of ideas around death and what happens and what's next. And, I think even just looking at religions of, some, hey, you can't do anything to the body right away. There's a time period because you're still, you're moving through, whatever. I'm butchering that obviously, but there's so many possibilities. And I think that's what kind of makes it exciting, but it is, the last adventure, right? Is
it the last
humans,
adventure? Yes. That's why I'm like, we don't know if it is the last adventure.
Yeah, totally. And in some ways it's kind of fun to then say, well, what happens if it's not? What happens? I think I play that what if game a lot of, well, what happens if this happens? I mean, what if we're just atoms in something much bigger?
Right. There's also the beliefs that we're in a video game simulation, right? So like, what if we are, and what if we could just go to the next level after this? And then there's and I was thinking, I was driving over here, actually, I was thinking about different societies and their viewpoints on death, where, there are some that are like, oh no, you reincarnate.
Yeah.
Like you come back.
Yeah.
And then there are even more of these variations. For example, I read one Kabbalah book that was talking about how women choose to come back in female form because they feel like the people around them like have not learned their lessons yet. And then everybody else comes back as whatever it is they are, because you're going up on that cycle. The top of it is a woman. There's different burial customs that have to do with the afterlife, right? That started, lifetimes ago. And so it's just, I think it's another reason why I'm so into this project, because I want to listen to everybody. I want to hear everybody's opinions. I want to hear everybody's takes on this. And the beautiful part of even learning about death doula profession and what kind of it entails is we are supposed to kind of have an understanding of all of these different cultures, and to know and understand that people on their deathbed, for example, might want to explore different spiritualities at the very end, just in case.
Yeah.
And to me, that's also fascinating. And it's funny, there was one quote that said something along the lines of, if an atheist is calling for a priest, that doesn't mean they become like Catholic or a Christian immediately. It just means that they want to know a little bit more and want to gain a little bit more of like knowledge before the end. And that's also fucking fascinating to me. So there's all of these aspects that you can philosophize on, and that you can ask different people based on their beliefs and their lived experience and their upbringing even. There's so many different ways to look at it. And I love that you're doing this, because you gather so much information that way, and then you can kind of pick and choose what you want to believe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, just even from the voicemails so far, I think there's been a couple about reincarnation, but in like maybe not vastly, but in different ways, and I was talking to a friend the other day, and they were mentioning, I think it's in the Ayurvedic practice, like you choose your parents. Mm-hmm. You come back and you choose your parents. So they were basically mentioning that like their parent was kind of talking about like, oh, I was such a bad parent for this and this and this. And he basically was like, well, in this practice, I chose you and I'm going to accept you that way, And so I don't know, it's just interesting to kind of look at all these different thoughts and opinions. And I just feel like I'm crowdsourcing, trying to find the best one. Because at the end of the day, like, getting back to, your beliefs and your thoughts, I think we're in a different place where you seem to have acceptance around it and not necessarily clarity, but it seems like you're okay with your beliefs that, yep, if this happens and I died, like, I'm okay. I think I'm in a different scope of like, with the majority of my thought being, hey, we just fade to black. And that kind of scares the fuck out of me.
Why does it scare the fuck out of you?
I think the biggest thing that I've kind of figured out is non-existence kind of freaks me out because I'm taking this class and one of the things that came up was, the three fears, fear of fear, fear of dying, and fear of death. And really for me, it is fear of death, of non-existence. And then that has set me off on a spiral of consciousness and what that means and whatnot. But I think that's the biggest thing for me is not being able to experience things with the ones that I love. And so I think with this, it is me trying to find something that I can kind of grab hold of and say, you know what? I do believe in that and that I'm okay. I'm okay dying now. Because I definitely right now, I would say I'm better than I was a year ago because I've actually, instead of running away, I dove into this deeper and explored it. And now it's, with the book club, reading at least one death book a month and, having conversations with you and other people, that's made it more comfortable, which is, my biggest hope because I'm not the only one, right? I know I'm not the only one who's terrified of death. And so just talking about it, learning about it, and I'm hoping through this process, I can find something that I can say, or maybe it is at the end of the day, my belief is that we just fade to black and that's okay.
And that's okay.
And maybe that's all it is, but
that's something I was going to actually say is like, what if you go through this entire process and then you're like, yeah, still feels like it's just going to fade to black.
Yeah. I mean, I think at least along the way, I'll have found some really good stories, really good ideas, really good beliefs. And in the end, we'll find out, I guess.
Yeah. Something to maybe think about what I'm hearing you saying, that you are afraid of the non-existent, right? And this, I think, kind of also I can connect to the feeling of immortality when you're younger, right? And then through the readings that I've done, through the conversations that I've had, right? If you are an older person, if you are actually physically at the end of your life, your body starts to kind of weigh everything down. And at that point, you're not trying to live. You're not trying to go out and have fun. You're not trying to see people. You're not trying to do anything. So your body is naturally saying, it's okay now to rest.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have this, and this is something I think about too, right? So I'm like, okay, of course, like I want to continue eating and fucking and talking and laughing and listening to music and seeing cool shit. Of course, like I want to hang on to that as hard as I can, but that's the part of living.
Yeah.
And something that my husband says a lot is he goes, I don't remember before I was born. So me thinking that I won't remember what happens after I die is the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's been a very cool thing to consider, right? Within all of these aspects is like right now you're a young person. You have all of these things going on in your life. You already have a lived experience of seeing cool shit, eating cool shit, meeting people, traveling. So you have that and that's your zest.
Yeah.
But when your body is no longer able to do these things, what happens to that zest?
Yeah, that's fair. I love the Buddhist idea of like the wave returns. And I've also a similar thing around a cloud never dies and also a candle. It's you have a candle and it's lit and you're the flame. When you blow it out, it's the flame's gone, but there's smoke and there's, so there's still existence in, just in a way that I don't think we can understand.
Or see. And I think we are very visual creatures as humans. And I think that's part of it. And that's where I think that kind of what you were talking about goes back to the idea that I believe about the energy. It's still there. It has nowhere else to be. So it goes around, right? It's still, you're still there. Like so I feel like we are all kind of like this hodgepodge of recycled energy of everyone that came before us. And I think part of that is also, like the generational traumas and like there's all of like health and all of these other things that are already kind of inscribed into our DNA.
Yeah.
But that DNA also has this this way of moving through the world.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's fascinating to me to figure out at the end what happens to it. Because I feel like you do find out. But even if you don't, then it doesn't matter because you won't know the difference.
Yeah.
Right? And it's funny because my daughter and I talk about this all the time. She's 7 and she's like, Mama, I just want to live forever with you. And I go, yeah, but if we do that, ouch. And then if we do that, how are we going to dance in the stardust together again? Yeah. And she was like, oh, and it's interesting. So I don't have an Ayurveda kind of belief system, but I do think that children come into our lives for a reason. And I think that we are all learning from one another. And so I even told her the other day, I'm like, I'm so glad that you came, like you chose me to be your mom. And she was just like, oh my God, really? Like, you're welcome. And I think it's also having a great conversation with children about mortality, and it's desensitizing, and it creates so many beautiful conversations with somebody who hasn't been tainted by the world. And it's so cool to have these conversations with my kid who like has all of these, books about mythology and also death and life, and just hearing like these beautiful things that happen inside of her head and hearing her ideas, no matter how goofy or very valid they can be, and bringing it all back to where we can talk about it. And I want to create this environment for the people in my life that it's totally okay to talk about death in any capacity. It's important. It's part of literally everybody's reality.
Yeah. So as you're touching on, I know you have multiple kids, husband, and obviously family and other loved ones.
And lots of animals too.
And animals. I think another important thing that, I want to do with this podcast is also maybe giving a little platform of telling them, or, what would you want them to know if you died tomorrow? I think that's something, and hopefully you don't die tomorrow, obviously, but we never know when it's going to happen. And I think a lot gets left unsaid with our loved ones because we think we have more time. It's, I'm not going to die for decades. And so what would you want them to know? Something that you want to leave behind?
To live life fully. I mean, honestly, more than anything. And, a lot of people say, oh, I want my kids to be happy. I'm like, yeah, but how do you get to that happiness? And for me, it's like, if you live a full life where you do what you need to do within reason, obviously, when you're not an asshole, but you live your life and you experience everything as fully and as carefully as you can. I always say I want my children to be fulfilled. Like, do everything that fills your cup, and that's where the happiness comes in. Once your cup gets full, that's where your happiness comes in. That's when like your natural self-esteem comes in, and spread that to the world. There's so many different ways to interpret that.
Yeah.
I feel like that I want to be broad, and I want them to know that they should just live fully and fulfill their lives and not hole up. And if holding up is fulfilling for them,
yeah,
great. And I mean, all my kids are very different. I do have introverted kids. I have extroverted kids, and it's beautiful to see. And the interesting thing has been for me to be okay with the way they are, because in the very beginning, I was very much like, I was thrown into motherhood. I have 2 bonus kids, and I was thrown into motherhood, and I didn't have any sort of understanding of how to parent. So I parented in the only way I knew how, and that was with guilt and shame. And then I started understanding how that is not the way to move forward. And as soon as I realized that, I then started to like celebrate the differences. And it was interesting. The last thing I kind of learned is one of my kids is totally happy having one friend and hanging out at home doing Minecraft. And he's totally fine with that. And for me,
that resonates very strongly over here. I could definitely go with only having one friend.
And that's beautiful too. But I remember we were at his therapist, and I was like, I just came to the understanding that that's totally fine for him. And I'm supportive of everything he might need. And, then having kids, like having another kiddo who's like very extroverted, but is totally cool with being alone. So that's another version. And then I have my daughter who's just like, wants to talk to the entire world, wants to perform, wants to like be out there, wants to tell everybody what she knows. And so to me, having this kind of general idea of I want you to do what fulfills you is the biggest like is the biggest advice I can give, because everybody is so different and that looks so different for everybody. Yeah, like I want them to be fulfilled, and I want them to love.
Yeah.
Of course I want them to be loved. Of course. But I want them to find ways to put love into the world, however that also looks. So yeah, I want my legacy to be, do you.
I love that. Well, yeah. So thank you for coming on the show. It was such a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being such a supporter of everything.
Oh yeah, I'm bringing pom-poms next time. We're cheering squad in it.
Well, yeah. Thank you. Do you want to share any social media, anything, or?
Not at this time, because I'm working on all of that stuff right now, but I think we can always come back to the notes and write that in when it's available. And right now, I think I just want people to remember that death is going to be a part of your journey, and talk about it as often and as loudly as you can.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of When We Die Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked some thoughts and helped you feel a little more at ease with the idea of death. Remember, this journey is all about exploring our beliefs and fears together, so I'd love to hear from you. Call our voicemail at 971-328-0864 and share what you think happens when we die. Your thoughts might just be featured on a future episode and could help others on their own journey. Until next time, have a good life.